Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. And this time on the podcast, I welcome Nirmala Nataraj. She is a New York-based writer, editor, book midwife, theater artist, and myth maker. Her work lives at the crossroads of creativity, mythology, storytelling, and collective liberation. As a multi-genre collaborator and creative facilitator, she believes in generative solutions in the midst of chaos, the coexistence of messiness and magic, and breathtaking beauty as a natural consequence of this wild ride. She is trained in a variety of methods of narrative-based collective healing, including family constellations, psychodrama, and playback theater. Some of the passions she brings to her facilitation include movement, especially 5 rhythms, guided visualization, and the induction of visionary states, the cultivation of radical intimacy with the human and more than human world, and creative collaboration from unexpected prompts. You can check out her work at nirmalanataraj.com or subscribe to her Substack newsletter, The Diving Bell Spider. All of that will be in the show notes, and I have been away from podcasting for a bit. It's been a minute. I'm really excited to be back in this space. I don't know what's going on with the sound in this episode. I feel like I'm coming to you from the bottom of a well. Nirmala sounds great. I sound echoey. Please listen anyway. This is a really great conversation. It feels very timely and pertinent for what's happening in the world right now. I hope that you enjoy my conversation with Nirmala Nataraj.
The last few months have been such a whirlwind for me, and I've been spiraling around sort of the same perennial set of questions that I think are part of what I've been starting to call it my soul codes. And I think everybody has a particular set of soul codes and questions that they kind of spiral around and come back to in different ways in their life. And I feel like that's been a very, emphatic aspect of my life right now, recognizing like, oh, wait, what are the soul codes? And how do I organize my life so that everything is rotating around those? And, not in the sense of like, okay, this is my purpose and my vision and that kind of thing, but more in a sense of, I think of your soul codes as being the set of questions, the set of unanswerable questions that provides kind of a portal into beauty and mystery. And anyway, all of that is to say that I feel like I'm somebody who's much more interested in the process of inquiry. So I've also been in a phase of my life where I'm kind of like, well, let's drop the sense of resoluteness and certainty and the idea that I have any answers or some kind of a framework that I've developed that enables me to make sense of everything in my life. And let's kind of just stay with the questions. So that's sort of what I allowed myself to do as I was coming into this conversation, just allowing myself to settle into the idea that it'll be a shared inquiry for both of us, which I'm super excited about.
Thank you. It's what is feeling most alive to me as well as this capacity for being in the liminality, because there aren't answers right now as much as part of me, and certainly a big part of the collective would love to have is answers and certainty. And it makes me think about, which I've said before, but about Stuart Davis telling me at one point when I was working with him, it's the price of entry into the, where we're going, whatever that is the ability to be in liminality and hold paradox and be with the question and the mystery and let it, for me, what I'm really coming into is letting it inform me and making decisions around it, even knowing that I'm not getting a solid answer, fully holding the mystery, and also listening to, I love that idea of soul codes and these set of questions. And as you were saying that, I was like, oh yeah, I've got that. That's been, present my whole life. And for me right now, it's the apocalypse, which I'm calling this time, and many others are as well, and that, but in the way of an unveiling or revealing like the original meaning of that word, not a fiery end, but a transformation, a portal, an uncovering, a revealing, and grief as the portal of the apocalypse, and what happens when we go through a process and get so far into authentic relationship with grief that it turns into something else. It becomes a doorway to something new. Um, so my questions have been around the apocalypse, around the feminine, the goddess, how to allow her to express through me as life herself. That's what I call her, life herself. And how that can, I mean, one of my other questions is like how to serve, and how to serve without, this is a new one for me, how to serve without um, framing in my mind that there's someone that needs saving or that there's a rescue that needs to happen, but reframe that as how to be in community with, how to be in relationship with, and how to show up when something arises in front of me where I can serve and be of help, but not in this, like, oh, there's this group of people that's got it all wrong and needs saving, or even that the world herself needs saving, but reframing for me all of this as a portal to something altogether new that we've never done in the current iteration of humanity, and how exciting that is. And it's like, oh, I'm playing a part in that if I say yes to the mystery. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of re-envisioning service, because service is so often mired in this binary idea of those who have and those who don't, or this is how things should be, and this is how things shouldn't be. And I think it gets to be really complicated as well when we get into a really self-aggrandizing place with service. Like, oh, this is my vision, and this is I've even been stepping away from the idea of purpose, which is kind of an interesting thing for me because I feel like I've always been a very purpose-driven person. And I think the problem with that is that for me, I used to see purpose as being this fixed aspect of self. And I think like the older I've gotten and the more kinds of, life transitions and mini deaths I've gone through, I I've started to see the even like the idea of soul, of embodied soul as being an unfurling process. And the more we unfurl, the more we reveal ourselves to ourselves, or life reveals us to us. Um, and with that, things change and things evolve. And even the idea of kind of a fixed purpose doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so I think if there's anything close to a remaining purpose, I feel it's kind of similar to what you said. It is allowing myself to be a conduit for the life energy, the erotic life force, the pure power and undiluted expression of the Great Mother, to the best of my ability, because of course I'm human and I am, the alchemical process of kind of coming into the world and again, living your soul codes, it's really messy and it's one that's filled with disappointment and grief. And yet I always come back to this idea of like, how can I be as clear and undistorted a vessel as I possibly can? And again, that just almost feels like an unanswerable question and a place that I'm never going to, there's always going to be that process of unfurling. So I'm never going to arrive at my final form or my final purpose. And so when I start to think, oh, wow, every sentient being on this planet is going through a version of the same thing, whether they consciously know it or not, they are also unfurling, and more is being revealed to them about themselves. Um, it's deeply humbling. And it also, I think, takes one out of this hierarchical idea that there are people who are saviors, and then there are those who are here to be saved. And I yeah, and I feel like in the last several months, and I think I had mentioned this to you at some point, Robin, that my dad passed away at the end of November, and that kind of also felt like an experience of crossing over a threshold. And the threshold was, the death of a parent is a really, really big one. And that coincided with my 45th birthday. Um, so there was also kind of this sense of like, all right, I'm stepping into the what one might call the second chapter of my life. And I'm doing this kind of in the physical and visceral absence of this person who was my father figure, for better or worse. And we had a very difficult experience. He really was sort of my greatest teacher in many ways, but also the archetypal patriarchal figure in my life who sort of held um, a lot of the toxicity that kind of came to greet me when I came into this world, female. Um, And I think in the wake of that experience, I feel like so many of my ideas about who he was and who I am in relationship with him have been upended. Um, a lot of people in the wake of my father's death, they had sort of this assumption that I was grieving. And I think the best way that I can explain it is that my life has been sort of a long mourning process because my father was my first love in many ways. I have this very clear recollection of being a child who absolutely adored him. And for a number of different reasons, um, that love never really got a chance to be fully expressed. And I think that to be a child and to learn the lesson that the love that is so immense and unconditional and such a natural part of who you are. And I think that's true for everyone. The idea that that cannot be expressed, that it needs to be locked down, I think it's one of the greatest forms of grief that we experience. And I don't know who said this, but um, I remember hearing a line somewhere that I thought was really evocative, and it was the idea that grief is just love with no place to go, with no energy to move it through. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I kind of feel like that was my experience of my relationship with my dad. Like there was this enormous amount of love that had no place to go. And that impacted every aspect of my life and my relationships with the people in it. And then suddenly, when he died, it was like there was this enormous energetic release, and all this love that had been there suddenly had freedom to move. And when that happened, I kind of feel like I started to see things in my life very, very differently. And it felt spontaneous to me. It felt like this was not, I've done a lot of personal work and I've had kind of a very long, winding spiritual journey over my life. But I think what happened here felt more like a spontaneous grace that was bestowed on me. And I still can't fully explain it, but I started to see my father's role in my life in a much larger way and not bound by this story that I had been robbed of having a good father and that I was irreparably fucked up because um, I happened to have a father who displayed so many sort of toxic patriarchal characteristics. Um, and I started to see that there's a much larger story, even in just kind of what one might consider the soul contract between me and my dad. And that there were aspects of that relationship that were still um, completely unknown to me. And I was starting to understand it a little better. Um, and so I think I've been in a state of gratitude and really grace in the wake of that experience. Because for me, it felt like, grief in and of itself is multifaceted. I think there are aspects of grief that are downright ecstatic because they open us up to our depths, and the depths aren't just sorrow, they're also where love lives and hangs out, right? Um, but I think this experience I've had in the last several months has been one of kind of rapturous love that makes me think of like the mystic poets and the people who followed sort of the devotional path of bhakti, and their entire life was an act of devotion, and grief and love coalesce, and it's just this enormous rapture in which we're just continuously humbled by how much we don't know. And even just in the wake of my dad's death, I started to think about my relationship with my mother differently. Um, Whereas in the past, I'd had sort of this image of my mother as being somehow weak or diminished by the fact that she had married this man who was very mentally disturbed. I started to look at my soul contract with my mother and my mother's own soul codes. And I began to recognize, oh, wow, her soul codes are completely different from mine. And her life is really about um, understanding and locating genuine kindness and compassion and generosity in the midst of just horrific circumstances. And, both my parents had much more difficult lives than I did. And so I think the entire experience for me of the last several months has been really a dislocation of my own understanding of purpose and service, and kind of this orientation to a picture of life that is much more complex, but also simultaneously much more simple than I've ever made it out to be, where it's like, oh, wow, all of it is love, and all of it is an expression of love, and all of it is an expression of some kind of divine consciousness seeking to meet itself with the utmost intimacy, and sometimes in the most horrific of places. And it's very difficult, obviously, for us as humans to really comprehend that, because we're still living in these very dualistic frameworks. And I don't think those dualistic frameworks are wrong or bad. I think they're just kind of a way that our consciousness is, that's kind of the primary framework around which our consciousness is centered. But I think we're in a time where we're starting to see that shatter. And like you said before, we are, so much of what I think will determine what happens next is going to be centered around our capacity to stay in the liminality, in the not quite yet, or the I don't know, or the oh, this is really strange, isn't it? It's not what I thought it would be. Um, and I think it's really, for me, even it feels like it's really important to kind of come back to my body, to not abandon myself in the midst of everything that's happening, because I feel like so many of the influences that we're surrounded by are asking us to leave the vessel of our bodies and leave those sacred questions that I think it would behoove us to stay in, and to respond with urgency to everything that's happening around us. And I think the paradox is that the more we slow down, and the less we respond from kind of this very dysregulated nervous system that is focused on urgency and fixing things and doing things and being useful, um, the more likely it is that we'll come back to our own intrinsic wholeness and act from that place, which is not about doing or saving or figuring anything out, but again, about being just a conduit for um, a life force that is inherently dynamic and intelligent and spontaneous and resourceful. Um, and I think for me right now, another way that I'm allowing myself to be sort of that clear and undistorted conduit is to move into greater relationality and intimacy with others, because I'm also recognizing, oh, like, wow, there's this incredible third space that opens up when we are in the presence of another and when we are both fully engaged with kind of our trembling aliveness. and and I'm talking about the kind of relationality where we're not afraid to step into our tenderness and are not knowing where you've probably heard that whole idea of there are all these different kinds of listening. There's the listening in order to be heard and the listening in order to respond, but then there's the listening um, that is just about being present with another and not rehearsing what's going to happen next. Um, and coming into sort of an organic sense of, oh, this is this is what's arising. Let's step into that together. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at what it means to be on this planet, because I feel like obviously there are so many people right now who are trying to come up with solutions for um, the quagmires in which we find ourselves with respect to everything in the world, climate crisis, rising authoritarianism. I mean, there are a lot of really, really big um, problems and issues that people are understandably trying to solve. And for me, I'm in a place where it's kind of like, a lot of people are talking about the next frontier of human consciousness being connected to like AI or technology or solving the climate crisis. And for me, the next frontier is relationality. And I think that establishing relationality first and foremost with ourselves, um, but also with the people, the entities, the plants, the animals, the land in our lives is one of the most radical things that we can do. Um, and I think a primary reason for that is that it changes us and it changes us into something that we can't actually predict. And it means that we are not the ones who ultimately have control. And we allow ourselves to cede control and to co-evolve and to become something that maybe, in our own private visions, we could never have imagined. So it's allowing ourselves to, there's that wonderful Octavia Butler quote about, I hope I remember it, God is change. Something about God is change. Like that's kind of the the core of it. Um, and if God is change, then that's that's what we are too, because we're no separate from this thing that we call God. And if we are constantly changing, that means that we can't really fix ourselves to any one identity. It's like we are awareness unfolding continuously. Um, and we allow ourselves to enter that process. And it's terrifying in the same way that for so many people, falling in love is terrifying because it's not something whose trajectory you can predict, and nor should it be. And I think the most ecstatic and transformative experiences of our lives are the ones in which um, we really give up the idea that we have any control whatsoever. Um, I mean, I think we have agency to a certain extent, but even that agency is really situated in a network of connections and relationships. Um, and I think for me, that's kind of the place where I'm allowing myself to rest. And it's um it's very it's very new, but to me, it's also part of this process of allowing myself to be cracked open by love and to to not know what's gonna happen when those floodgates open, and who am I going to be, and where am I going to go, and what will the next step I take be? I might have ideas of that. Um, and again, I mentioned kind of those soul codes, those perennial questions that we walk with, but I don't even think that those can truly be answered or sort of located in a single purpose or service. And I just feel like I went off in a million different directions, but I was really inspired by what you said about service and kind of maybe changing the way that we think about service and looking at it from a new perspective. But yeah.
I'll just say that that was extraordinary. Thank you. You have articulated so many things that feel very alive to me right now and very um, vital for my process. And yeah, I have so many things that want to come up and be spoken. I guess I'll say in response to that, where I am with that process, that I feel a lot of resonance with what you're talking about. And thanks for sharing about your dad and your mom and the grief and the um, coming into a new understanding about those relationships in different ways. And everything that you're bringing and describing feels so true to me. And also, my journey with this is bringing the body along and bringing the parts of the self along that, it's all about this relationship between like the body, all the parts of myself, which are coming into more and more like integrity and wholeness, which is a really interesting process after spending so much time with the parts and seeing this like, oh, something new is happening. And so it's the relationship between that and the divine or the mystery, and how to hold both with um, total and complete devotion to both. I don't think it's a mistake that we're embodied as humans on this planet. I don't think it's like something that we have to remedy by going up and out. I became sort of a dissensionist at some point, and it's like, no, I want to go down and in. I want to go to the underworld. I want to find it was the dark mother who called me, this regenerative death, life, death, grief, love, all of that happening. And now I'm finding myself coming even into more wholeness with that. So it's down and in, and it's also up and out. It's like we have the capacities to do all of
Right.
this. Um, I'll say, so I don't know, this story wants to be told, so I hope it's okay if I do a little bit of story time. I've been doing some work with parts because of love, actually, because of you mentioned like people being afraid to fall in love. That's a really big one for me because I have so many times, and the parts that had a lot of trauma in those experiences um, need a lot of care when I approach that threshold again. And so that's what's been coming up. And I've been doing parts work. And I had an experience yesterday. Parts work to me is like, that's the name we call it. And it's fantastic. And it needs a name and it needs a framework. But the experience of it feels very mystical to me, very kind of multidimensional and in contact with an other and myself at the same time. And this union of the two, it's really extraordinary. And so I was doing parts work with a really skilled practitioner, and had the experience of this very young, very tender, very innocent part who the her experience of joy and goodness in the world was so enormous and so extraordinary. And it made me think of what you said about love and grief, that grief is love with nowhere to go. And she had places because of my childhood, which was a mix of things. But one of the things was that I grew up very connected to the land and to nature. And we had chickens. And so we had baby chicks and we had um, animals all around. And four distinct seasons. So, strawberries came and it was just, there were all of these things that were so intensely beautiful and so intent, like a goodness, like just this sense of goodness. And then, as happens, at some point, relatively early on, there was a series of shocks that made that level of joy and love and goodness and just the ecstasy of being alive on this planet feel stopped and kind of unsafe and not have anywhere to go. And in this parts work, we invited in that part and worked with her. And she was showing me all of that joy and goodness and beauty. And I could only experience so much of it. There was a real sense of unsafety, or uh, it was unsafety because of fear, like, wow, if I really let all of this in, then the grief that inevitably is part of this cycle of this great round will, I don't know that I would survive it in relation to the bigness of that beauty and joy. So the part that came in and protected me and sort of tamped that down a little bit was doing me a service, by keeping it smaller. And after lots of work, able to open to that sensation and feel it in the body. And it feels like the next kind of turning of the wheel for me, where I've done so much work with grief and built all of this capacity to feel fully in those spaces in the underworld. And now kind of the most tender part to me is coming is being with the rest of that circle, which is joy and goodness and ecstasy. The ecstasy that, like, grief and ecstasy to me, and grief and joy have this, there's this like alive moment of friction that is, I think, what the universe is made of. Like, it's that big, it's so powerful. And that's really exciting because, as you say, I don't, it feels to me more and more like there's a process happening that I can get on board with or not, actually. And if I don't, it's quite uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But if I say yes to this unfolding process on the planet, what it means is that I allow life to move through me with no resistance to the reality that there will be grief, that there will be death, that there will be, like, that's part of the cycle here. And also, that for me, part of that process is we don't know what's coming. We don't know what will unfold. And also, it feels like creativity is an option, that we get to participate in the creation of something new that in some way feels inevitable at this point, which is great. I hope that it is. Um, so I would add in, for me, so much resonance with what you said. And also, when deeply aligned with that life coming through, there's a creativity that is available so that we're both, like, walking across this bridge to a new future as of yet unknown, and also creating it as we're walking it. And that feels very alive. And I'll say quickly one more thing. I um, choosing to, or being, having the capacity to do what you're talking about, which is be in relationship to something different than what I call the overculture is in relationship to, with all of its weight and gravity. It has so much gravity to it that doing these things in a different way feels like the medicine of the opposites. It feels like, you use the word radical. It feels radical to me to plant an orchard, which is what we spent the week doing here with my 77-year-old parents. It's the most hopeful act. Like, it's so tender to see that happen. And there's something about doing something like that, because that's what's calling, that feels like um, it neutralizes something in the polarity or in the duality, and it becomes this other thing. I'm thinking the last guest that I had, Michelle, she talked about being shown by these entities that this place is not a place of peace necessarily. This is a place of creativity. And it's the holding of these tension of the opposites that it's like a triangle, it's the tension of the opposites that creates something new. So I'm very excited about everything that you're sharing. Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah.
thank you for sharing all of that. Gosh, there's so many things to say to that, but I I feel like I came to that conclusion recently as well because I think that there's something really poignant about the desire for peace, and especially on a planet that has been through so much war and bloodshed and trauma and conflict on both a minor and major scale. Um, but at some point, and a lot of the work that I do is kind of in the dream realm, but also in the realm of just kind of trance-induced states. And honestly, actually, not really through entheogens and plant medicine. And I have a lot of really dear associates who kind of have been doing a lot of visioning with those particular resources. But for me, it's more like, okay, I can just sort of sit down and ask the Great Mother to sit with me and receive these really interesting and clarifying visions. Although I don't really get visions. It's more like voices and knowings. And one of the things that came to me also was that this is not a place where peace, in kind of the ways that we tend to envision peace, um, is even possible as a continuous state. This is a place where we have come to fertilize the ground with our blood, our sweat, our tears, our effort. Um, and the way in which we can do that and the way in which we might experience conflict, that's the thing that we have the option to shift. Conflict doesn't need to happen through this sense of, warring dualities, like the war with the masculine and feminine, or the idea of good and evil, light and darkness, one faction against the next. Um, and that is the state in which we've lived for a very long moment in human history, a long moment, but not the entirety of the eye blink that constitutes our time on this planet, on this earthly plane. Um, so I love what you're saying about creativity and even the idea of conflict. Or even, I think a lot about the alchemical crucible in which chemical reactions take place. And I think I had mentioned this maybe once to you before via email, that the idea that we're kind of in the midst of a state change. So there are all these different chemical reactions that are happening, and some of them can feel really destabilizing because they're meant to be. But we're in we're in the crucible, in the midst of a state change, and we don't know what we're going to be on the other side. And this is also just what the process of raw creativity looks like. It is being inside the mess. It is being inside kind of the indeterminacy. Um, and I think that we can come to that from a place of enormous tenderness and care and compassion and love. Um, but for me, this process of, I loved what you said about planting an orchard. And I think a lot about how so many of the people I know who are artists and activists and mystics will use this metaphor of planting seeds. And seeds might be very small, and we don't necessarily know what they will bear, or if they will result in anything. But there is this act of planting seeds wherever we go that is, inherently um, creative. But for me, the seeds that I'm planting, in a strange way, have very little to do with peace on this planet. And now that's kind of a relative term. Um, but I think that if we take sort of the larger view, um, so often when people think about peace, to me, it feels like this very kind of um, sterile and antiseptic vision of what it means to be in connection with one another and with the world. And it sort of removes the wild and ecstatic aspects of who and what we are. And when I think about the evolution of our species, or even just the evolution of life on this planet, and what I like to think of as the birthing of the world soul, which I believe a lot of us are doing that right now. I myself am not a mother, but I had this vision a few months ago of being hugely pregnant and recognizing, oh, I'm not birthing a child. I am one of the beings on this planet who is birthing the world soul in a new rendition of itself. And to me, that world soul cannot just be sort of this distant, transcendent, lofty, all is good, all is light, all is love aspect. It needs to include the parts of us that are wild and clawed and fearsome and really kind of unpredictable, like the beastly aspects of existence, because that's also the reality of being on this planet. And another way I like to think about it, and I've taken to thinking about it in actually a really joyful way of late, is that at the end of the day, we're all food for this planet. And are we going to allow ourselves to be part of a delicious feast? Are we going to once we leave this form, this body behind, um, what is the nourishment that we are choosing to leave? And I think that's a question that all of us need to ask ourselves. And I have come to the conclusion of, like, I used to always think, oh, it's peace, it's harmony. And now I really feel it's more about alignment and integrity, um, the capacity to dance with truth and all of her manifestations. I mean, I grew up in a Hindu family, and um, although there was kind of an element of patriarchy that I think is part of a lot of world religions, there was also this really deep engagement with the divine feminine, and the divine feminine as Shakti, which is literally the creative power of the divine that manifests in all these different forms. So you have kind of the fearsome, gruesome, bloodthirsty aspect of Kali, but you also have the great mother as the ultimate nurturer. And I think for me, recognizing, like, oh yeah, the integration is about locating all of those aspects within ourselves and treating them with great tenderness and respect. Um, and and I think for me, like, the place where I really am, and this, it feels very radical, because in many ways it's not really a, a lofty spiritual path. It's just to never abandon myself. And there are parts of myself that I want to abandon all the time, like I feel like I'm constantly walking around with um, this kind of 5-year-old version of me who is whiny and afraid and irritable, and who doesn't believe that she's ever going to be loved in the way that she deserves to be loved. There are all these aspects of self that I think so many of us are taught to believe that we need to kind of get rid of. We need to jettison them altogether if we are to be useful citizens. And I feel like the most important work that we can do is to stay with those parts. I mean, I guess this is kind of the what a lot of people talk about when they talk about reparenting the self, and to recognize, but it's not just to give those parts comfort, it's to recognize that those parts are essential aspects of the self. And the parts of who we are that we most want to change. Um, the great irony is that, and in some ways, I don't actually think that we are here to change some part of ourself that we've come to see as unredeemable. I think we're here to experience greater freedom in terms of how we move with all the parts of ourselves. Um, but I don't think we can actually do that, and unless we're able to look at the aspects of who we are that we tend to diminish, that we tend to turn away from, that we tend to say, oh my gosh, that is so cringe, that's so embarrassing. I fucking hate that about myself. Um, and not just to turn towards them and to give them care and compassion, but to actually be willing to say, this is this is my unique beauty. This is the part of me that um, that I know that this is the part of me that is the most divine. Not that we're creating hierarchies of most to least, but when we're actually able to stay with these parts of ourselves that most of us have been taught to abandon in order to appear, you know, like we've mastered something about the spiritual path or about life in general, um, something changes in the way that we relate to ourselves. And I think something changes in the way that we relate to the world around us. And that sense of splintering, um, that I think all of us experience. You were talking about, I forget what the word was that you used, but um, in relationship to that, the joy and the goodness that you experienced when you were in connection to the land. But then there were things that happened that created a sense of kind of fear and contraction, right? Um, and I've done a little bit of work with Mesoamerican shamans, curanderos, who talk about this. They don't talk about it in terms of trauma, but they have a word susto, which is Spanish for fright, and just like the almost the idea of like there's something that happens. I think you use the word shock. There's a shock to the system, and in sort of that in curanderismo, there's this idea that when there's a shock to the system, a part of the soul flees. And what we experience, what we might call trauma, is soul loss or power loss. So even doing parts work, I think, is a way to sort of gather all of these aspects of the self that have not felt safe enough to be close to our embodied experience, the ones that are kind of floating somewhere outside the body, and we're calling them back in. Um, and the reality is that for a lot of us, we're not necessarily going to experience, like, I don't even know if it's possible to experience um, complete safety in our embodied reality, because it's just for so many people who are highly sensitive, who are feeling, their own soul loss and their own power loss, they're also feeling the splintering of the current world and the larger kind of collective consciousness. Um, but I do think that for me personally, the more work that I've done with self-compassion and I'm not even, when people talk about self-love, like I feel like there's this kind of generic idea that self-love is like, oh, you're good, you're kind, you're powerful, you're brilliant. It's sort of like gassing yourself up in what feels like a very no offense to people who are on social media, I myself am not, but this very sort of Instagrammable idea of what self-love is in terms of being confident and happy all the time. But to me, self-love and self-compassion are not for the parts of myself that might already feel confident or powerful or aligned with a larger vision or mission. It's for the parts of myself that have never felt that way and that are always lurking in the background, kind of like orphans, wondering if they are ever going to be loved. And it's like these parts of ourselves can feel so insatiable. But I've been looking at that kind of insatiability and thinking, like, oh, this is the insatiability of the universe that is so hungry for intimacy with itself that it maybe sent us out as emissaries into this earthly reality to have this collection of strange experiences. Um, and I think that to me, that's what the spiritual path is. It's intimacy. It's kind of the carnal and the spiritual making contact. It's light making contact with darkness. It's the experience of an epiphany, I think, takes place when we're actually open to that kind of deep intimacy um, with ourselves and with the world around us, and with also just kind of the most tender aspects of self, which are often masked as being sometimes the most insatiable or aggressive or whatever it is we want to call it. But I often find that where there's great hurt, that's often also like where there's tenderness, tenderness that lives beneath the facade of the armor. And armor is kind of a metaphor that I constantly come back to in thinking about my own experience on the spiritual journey, the ways in which I have been really armored against my life, and the function of that armor, which I think is extremely important. And again, especially for people who are highly sensitive. Um, and I think that the process of removing that armor is also something that has to happen over time. Like I used to think that I needed to be sort of this spiritual powerhouse and I needed to kind of burn through my karma and um, be in a constantly awakened or enlightened state. And that's not who I am. I mean, I have a lot of I have a lot of really questionable qualities. I mean, I can be extremely judgmental and kind of a curmudgeon. I'm a very insular person in many respects, but even that armor is a part of kind of the tenderness that is asking to be um, covered until it's ready to be shared. And this also sort of, for me, gets at the idea of, I mean, whatever you want to call it, divine timing, Kairos time as opposed to Chronos time. And I strongly believe that you can't force the unfolding of the soul. And that has been a really important lesson for me, especially in the last few months, and recognizing like, wow, all these incredible things happened after my dad's death, but that was a rite of passage that I had no control over. I couldn't just will myself to have the realizations that I had. Um, a portal needed to open, and certain portals only open when the timing is right, and we ourselves don't have control over that. And I think that there's something that's so freeing about that, because it means that, you know, the spiritual path is one in which we have a certain amount of agency, but I'm not even sure that we have as much agency as we think we do. And I do believe that there's kind of a whole cluster of um, you know, gods, angels, demons, whatever you want to call them, energies, things that are happening on different planes of reality that are influencing what we experience here, which is also why I think for me, surrender is such an important aspect of my life, and surrendering to the fact that I don't know. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm supposed to become. And I don't know what's going to happen next. But what I do know is that in the present moment, I experience greater freedom when I actually open up to love, when I surrender to love. Um, which again, love is a really big word. And it can mean so many different things to so many different people. Um, but my experience of this reality is that love is kind of the undergirding substance or vessel that holds everything else. And when I allow myself to be inside that love, suddenly everything gets a little bit bigger, a little bit more spacious. There's more breathing room. There's more of a sense of recognition of the options that are available, even when it feels like there aren't very many.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of that. So many things again that resonate. Yeah, I hear a sense of whole, um, for me, what happened was a reorientation around spaciousness and wholeness and what that means, which I don't have any idea what wholeness ultimately means. Uh, that feels more like an invitation, So as you were saying about these parts of ourselves that feel like we would love to get rid of them and don't want to admit that they're ours, bringing them in and getting them closer and saying yes. And that's what a lot of this process feels like to me collectively as well. It's like the pushing away and saying everything except for that, or everything except for that feels like maybe it needed to be that way for a while. Maybe that's part of the unfolding that is happening that we don't have control over. If I trust life herself, then it includes all of this. And so it's a process of welcoming in more and more, and this, and this, and this. And um, so internally and externally, I had a teacher that would say, first safe for ourselves, and then for the room, and then for the world. It's this starts here and then moves out. And I love the note about safety as well. Maybe I need a new definition about what that actually is. I can feel an inquiry there. What is safety? And it brings me to this idea that I felt in what you were saying as well, that surrender, which I call in my internal landscape saying yes, just saying, agreeing,
Yeah.
consenting basically to this thing that is happening. And that even the idea that there is duality in the thing that is happening feels like not quite right. Exactly. It's this, there's this wholeness that's unfolding. I can say the agency is in my mind that I can say yes or no to it. And a long time ago, I remember the beings told me when I was in like the depths of something, uh, they they were like, this can be as uncomfortable as you'd like it to be. Like you can resist, you can hang on, that was all that I had capacity for. So there's no judgment against what I was able to experience at that time. But the invitation was just like, or you can just say yes, to this unfolding. Um, so part of that, it's interesting talking about, God as change. And I would say that's this something that's really up for me as well, of this what Marion Woodman called the death mother, which is this concretizing, freezing energy that wants everything to change or to stop changing and to be still and static, and feels very connected to the kind of solar aspect or the ascension aspect that is connected to an unchanging thing, or to an idea that we're going to get somewhere and then everything will quote unquote be okay, versus the constant changing and regenerating that is the goddess, that includes death. Not like, as you were saying, not getting to a point on the planet or in our evolution or with this idea that we're going to get somewhere and then it's all going to be peace or unchanging something that we correlate somehow with safety. And that actually that it is saying yes to basically death. I think that that's a huge part of, I think it's at the very core of the connection to the goddess and death that is not existent in the overculture is what we're seeing play out. Anything to prevent even the idea of death as a changing thing. And the death mother actually even makes death dead. Like it doesn't move, it doesn't change. And that's sort of the goal. And then we can see this, it's like becomes necrotic. There's no oxygen, there's no regeneration, there's no composting that happens. It's this idea that we need to stop. which makes, you know, which I understand because of trauma. Like, let's all just, sometimes there's this deep desire in me as well to just stop, because I need to breathe. And yet that is not what's happening here. And so even the idea of getting to a place that we've never been, as far as I know, like we have this view of human history that I've been doing a lot of digging into, like, what is the timeline here, and when were these cultures the way that they were? And you know, the Venus of Willendorf was is 27,000 years old, and we have kind of a collective memory that's about, if we really stretch and look, it's maybe 12,000 years old, you know, of when things began to change for us, and then patriarchy, like 6,000 years old. And if I can align myself with the idea that none of these were mistakes, and again, learning from Marion Woodman and her book, beautiful book, Dancing in the Flames, talks about matriarchy being a time of power from nature, patriarchy, power over nature. And what I hope we're moving into is something new that I don't have a word for, but that is power with nature. You know, that there's a union of the two coming, basically. And that's what I want to be in service to. Is I don't want to go back to, I don't think that it's a mistake that we're moving forward and moving through, and that there's change, and going back to a time that we've maybe idealized, of the matriarchy, which from what I've looked into, and according to, these teachers that I'm following, there wasn't art about war. There wasn't art, you know, there were not a lot of weapons. Like it can seem like a very, idyllic place. And yet, as the part of process of becoming more individuated as humans, leaving the mother, we have to leave the mother and individuate. And then can there be some sort of return that includes more than the sum of its parts? And that feels really alive to me. And it feels very connected to the part of the whole that isn't in the overculture right now, which is goddess and death, the things that have been in the underworld and been sort of waiting in the underworld. So I would love to hear your experiences or thoughts, anything that's alive for you around the goddess and death and the underworld. And
Oh my gosh, there's so much. There's so much in what you've said. And I feel it's sometimes really easy for me to start to intellectualize the idea of the goddess and to sort of move into like, okay, well, the Eleusinian mysteries and the Gnostic teachings, and I think that all of those things are very, very important. But a lot of my own experiences of the goddess have really been through, they've been through portals that have opened to me in the midst of grief, um, in the midst of really just there's a process that I take myself through that I call going into the void, which is literally disengaging from technology, being in time that is very unstructured. It's almost like it's like being in the midst of, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of just being so um, physically ill that you can't do anything, you can't sleep, you can't focus. You're just kind of in this state of um, receptivity to what is, and the your sense of self is kind of constantly flickering in and out. Well, that's kind of a state that I work with when I do this thing that I call going into the void, which usually entails stepping into a dark closet, my walk-in closet, and just kind of allowing myself to be there. It's not even meditation because there's not even necessarily a sense of, okay, I'm gonna be with my breath. I'm gonna breathe through what is. Sometimes it's sitting with the experience of existential terror. Now, I don't recommend that anybody necessarily do this. I feel like I've had several years of working with different therapeutic somatic modalities in order to be able to hold myself in this state. And it's not always terrifying. Sometimes it's absolutely lovely. Um, and it's like kind of floating in space. But to me, this experience of meeting the void, of actually allowing myself to sort of linger in this space where it's not that thinking isn't there, but there's something that exists beyond thinking. And I feel like that's actually kind of ultimately the point of meditation. It's not to get rid of thinking. It's not necessarily to enter into a state of peace. It is to enter into that state where we are inseparable from the void, which is not easy because it does, I think, to a certain extent, annihilate some aspect of who we are, and it feels akin to death. Um, but is it okay if I read you something that I wrote recently that kind of came from a vision that I had where that was actually quite unexpected, but it was a vision that I had during kind of a practice of going into the void, which I do every month. I take a weekend to just spend hours in my closet and just sit in this state of rapt um, curiosity. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm just sitting here. And sometimes I'm doing that for hours. And then other times there are things that sort of come unbidden. And other times it's totally boring and completely unpredictable. Um, but and this was a recent experience that I had where I feel that what came through was a sense of receiving symbols that reflected the qualities of, again, those soul codes that I mentioned earlier, but also what we might be experiencing on this planet. Um, and it was a fascinating experience because to me, it felt like it was this spontaneous vision that I had of the goddess, and the goddess as regenerative, and the goddess as the aspect of life that is not only seeded by sun and water and kind of the things that are that are coming down from above, but the things that are ascending also from below. Um, and this was really interesting because the meditation itself began, or it wasn't really a meditation, it was kind of a spontaneous vision. It began with the blooming of a rosebud, which has always been really symbolic to me, like the unfurling of this closed entity, this closed and protective entity. And of course, the rose in many mystical traditions is associated with the goddess. Um, and and then from that, there was this entire landscape that emerged. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of my notes from that. Um, so what I saw was what felt like a living geography, and it was kind of the furrowed curvature of Earth, um, almost like curving toward itself. And the way that I saw it was as like fingers around a secret. And for me, I immediately saw like, oh, this is the image of the body of the goddess. And specifically what came to me, which is a little bit surprising, was this is the body of the goddess Isis. And it was surprising to me because I don't have a strong sense of connection to Isis. Um, and what I was seeing is that the body of the goddess is the land, and what was coming was the delta of the river Nile as a convergence of all of these elemental essences like soil and river, um, and flooding and fertility and chaos and papyrus fronds. Um, and the vision was not linear. It was something that kind of ripened. So even just writing it down was an interesting process to get that very non-linear vision of the goddess and to have it come through. Um, but first, I saw sort of those furrowed ridges of the earth that were very feminine and fecund. And then I saw the waters of the underworld rising up. So not rain from sky to ground, but arising from beneath, like I mentioned before. Um, and then that made me think, oh, Osiris wasn't just the husband of Isis, but he was the god of the underworld. So he was the inseminator from the soil, from death, and from the darkened depths of light before it becomes green again. So there's this intimate union that comes from death, um, the union with death that enables the earth to become lush. So this inversion of the solar seed narrative, I felt in my vision, was very ancient. And the feminine is not passive in this vision. The feminine is hungry and reaches from below. And in that reaching, there's a feeding that happens. Um, and so there were a lot of things that occurred in this vision, and there was, this whole experience of witnessing the greening of the planet and the feeling that, oh, I am part of the wild greening of the earth. But the greening of the earth is also about seasons and cycles and a stripping away and then like a return of the foliage, right? Um, so when I think of death, also I think of the cyclical intelligence of fertility and not, this eternal spring, but kind of a seasonal um, gnosis and locating ourselves also in the winter and the bareness and knowing how to root into every season of our lives. And that includes the ones where we're stripped bare. Um, and then what was really interesting to me is that this vision involved moving into the earth. So, sort of stepping into that furrowed land. And what surprised me there is, we have a lot of ideas of what the underworld is and what sort of the place of death is. Um, but what kind of arose for me here was what I can only describe as a heart womb. Um, so the underworld wasn't, like there's the idea of the underworld not being a tomb, but a womb. And in this place, it was very much alive. It was kind of pink and rose colored, and it was this breathing tunnel, um, which I felt was, oh, this is really interesting. It's almost a reversal of patriarchal horror narratives because the underworld wasn't hell. It was pulsing and breathing and embodied and sensual. And and this whole place that I found myself stepping into, I described it later on in my writing as an eight-chambered heart womb. Um, and then it made me think about eight signifying, balance and cosmic order and infinity when it's turned on its side. Um, and in this place, there was just this sense of being surrounded by possibility. And each of the eight chambers that led into the heart womb, if you if you sort of turned and you put your ear against each of these entrances or exits, depending on how you look at it, you could hear a song. And there was a different song sort of playing from each of and each of those songs represented uh, a possibility, not a static possibility, but a possibility for the soul. And it made me think, oh, well, maybe this is the possibility of what we might incarnate into. And I am obsessed with near-death experience narratives and what people experience when they, through sort of the lifting of the veils when they're on the other side and when they receive information about things like soul contracts and um, their next incarnation or past lives or that sort of thing. So what I was experiencing here was like, oh, there are these eight different songs that correspond to some sort of frequency that is connected to the soul. Um, and what I felt in this place was death, yes, but also regeneration, resurrection. Um, I really liked what you said about kind of going further in because there was just such a sense of internal enclosure here, the feeling of being inside a cocoon And within that cocoon, there's exposure to possibility and regeneration. Um, and I felt as I was in this place, this was not just a metaphor. It was kind of a sense of this is soul intimacy, and this is the logic of the womb. And in this place, I also felt that I wasn't being asked by the Great Mother to serve through a sense of toil or martyrdom, but there was, this very literal connection to listening and to singing and to attunement and connection with the song lines and singing into the tunnels and then hearing the song inside the tunnels change. And I thought that was really beautiful. And it made me think about resonance and coherence and what it means to kind of be with the truest vibration of what we are. And I felt like, okay, this is a resting place. This is the resting place that we move into um, when we experience death. And I also feel like one of the great myths that we encounter is that death is kind of the finality at the end of a life, and then it's all over. But in truth, we I think I've actually entered into this eight-chambered heart womb that I entered in my vision many, many times in my life. And there have been many deaths and there have been many rebirths. And so I think that when we recognize, the great mother and the feminine is this cyclical intelligence and is connected to change, but is also connected to sort of these um, almost like these spirals of becoming. So sometimes it looks a little similar to the one that emerged before it, but it's also a little bit different. Um, I think that we can actually experience a sense of comfort because I feel that the vision that I had is really, it's about life and it's about death and it's about the spaces in between. And it's about sort of the awareness that even though we've been indoctrinated with so much fear around the process of death, and that's, been inculcated in us by religion, but also I think by the idea that that so many of us have around like, oh, well, this is it, like this body, this incarnation, this experience of me, this is it. And how can I give it up? And what else is out there? And I think also just some of the ideas we have about hell and the underworld, et cetera. Um, this to me felt like it was kind of a reclamation of the idea of darkness and the unknown as fertilizer for our experience of becoming. Um, and to me, that is also something that kind of reverses like this dominant mythos that we tend to have around yeah, being saved or penetrated from above, or like there's this can be sound kind of funny, but I've always thought of the Jesus narrative of resurrection as being about the resurrection that occurs when we're willing to sojourn into the underworld. And even just that image of the the boulder being removed from the cave and the idea of entering into the darkness and then rising up from that. I mean, these stories have been around since time immemorial, not just with Jesus, but also with the descent of the Sumerian goddess of heaven and earth, Inanna, and then the Eleusinian mysteries that are associated with the goddess of agriculture, Demeter, and her reunion with her daughter Persephone, who spends 6 months in the underworld and 6 months above on earth. I mean, I think all of these are stories about the promise of regeneration and the promise of becoming, um, and and the promise of intimacy with that which lives beyond the veil. And And I think that kind of intimacy is something that a lot of us are looking for, but that intimacy can only occur through the acceptance of death. Um, and death is really no separate from life. It's always very fascinating to me, even just to look at the earth and to think, oh, there are so many things that are in the process of being born, but they can only be born when other things die. And we are always in a process of both being birthed and dying. Even just any single organism, if we look at ourselves on just, I'm not even talking about metaphorically, but on the cellular level, this is what's happening to us all the time. And I think that when we really allow ourselves to kind of enter into the mysteries of many of the myths of the divine feminine. And again, I am sure there will be people who disagree with me, but I really do believe that the Jesus narrative is connected to an older cycle of stories about the divine feminine and the cyclical intelligence of the earth and of us as well as parts of the earth as being no separate from nature. To me, this is really key to understanding the divine feminine, not just as sort of this sensual or maternal creatrix, but um, as the one who is always connected to the underworld, the one who is, literally inseminated by the underworld, the one who allows herself to die in order to be reborn. So I hope that wasn't too much of a detour.
That was perfect. Thank you so much. Just, yeah, enormous resonance. I love the vision of the heart womb and of it being in this alive place and the songs. There's so many things that I'm in one of those periods, and it just kind of started back up where kind of everything in my life is um, orienting around the same ideas or questions. And so many things that you brought are connected to that. Even the 8 chambers and the going down and in. I was when I started doing work with the goddess and learning more, I was very lucky because this was the invitation and the orientation was to the dark mother, to the underworld, to her um, as regeneration, as safety in safety. I'm gonna think about that one. I'm gonna come back to safety a lot, but that it's okay to die, right? And as you talked about that you've been to this place many times, even in this life, that there is this that we go through these deaths all the time, and to me, it's a death practice, of learning to trust saying yes to these processes that are happening, and so. Yeah, so many things that you brought, really, really beautiful and powerful, and reminds me of another name for Ereshkigal, who is Inanna's sister down in the underworld. And another name for her is the Great Round, that she's essential to all of this. And that we can kind of see what it looks like when there's a split and a separation between these ideas of light and dark or life and death or any of these dual ideas when there's this core separation that happens, there is a rejection of the other in some way, and that there's a wholeness that is um, being invited right now, like in my life personally. And I think if there was something, if there was like a word that could encapsulate what may be coming in the next 100 years or something, it would be an integration towards wholeness, towards reunifying all of these places that we have been like enculturated to think of as separate, and not only separate but like reviled. Don't go down there. It's not.
Yeah.
It's yeah. It is a hell realm, or it's even repulsive. The feminine and what the goddess is has been pushed into these realms, and so the reunification of the great round and how she's so needed. And it's interesting to see how she's coming to us. And this was another thing that came through Marion Woodman's work. She said at one point, because there's no space for her in our culture, for this energy, right? Whatever she is, she's beyond words. But because there's no space for her, she's coming through us, like coming through our dreams and our visions and our bodies and the experience of uh, when you and I were talking before you used the words like grief and eros or grief and ecstasy and this confluence of those things and how that's been my call as well. And I'm getting closer and closer to that experience of letting that, the ecstasy of the wholeness of both of these seeming opposite things move through me and finding at their very center this experience that is completely beyond words, that is both, as you said, like both annihilating and generative at the same time. It's just this like death, birth, grief, ecstasy at this point, this sort of like forever dissolving point, this sort of black hole at the center of every single, atom of existence that's life, that's her, that's like immanence in form. And how all of this, like all of these big words and all of these ideas and concepts and the visions and all of that is coming through our bodies. And what an extraordinary experience that is. And I could talk to you for 5 more hours, and I hope that you come back. But I want to just be mindful of time. I wonder if is there anything else that you want to speak into the space. We have minutes and minutes and minutes, so not that we have to close right this second. But if there's anything else that you'd like to speak here, I would love to receive it.
Yeah, thank you. I really would love to just sort of briefly speak to this idea of erotic grief, um, and the way in which grief is a doorway to ecstasy. And I think that so much of what I've been experiencing as erotic grief is really a process of reclaiming wholeness and recognizing the ways in which the feminine in particular has really been sundered from this larger vision, this larger kind of cosmology of consciousness. And I think that there are lots of people out there who've spoken to this. And I think, but at the same time, the grief is something that's visceral. It's not intellectual. Um, and that's something that I have really been living inside, just an awareness of how um, there has been sort of a split and a sense of fragmentation that has kept me from accessing the totality of my own life energy because of the fact that I was made to feel afraid of it. And I think that this erotic grief is not just connected with the body and sexuality and sensuality, it's connected to our experience of reality. And so we have this very small, very circumscribed vision of reality that one could call consensus reality, which in and of itself is in flux. And we're starting to kind of see, the ontology of consensus reality splitting and falling apart. But it also makes me think about our capacity for access to the mystery and how that is something that we also have been taught to fear. And I think that these two things are very similar to each other. We've been taught to fear ourselves. We've been taught to fear um, the wild and sacred knowledge of our bodies, of our capacity for just the entire spectrum of human feeling. And I think especially through our sexuality. And I feel like there are still things we've yet to really fully understand about the conduit that I think is present when we actually step into what people might think of as sacred sexuality, and that's sort of a separate conversation. But I think that's something that um, we've really just only kind of touched the tip of the iceberg of what it means for the body to be this sacred oracle through experiences of opening up to the full extent of our sexuality, which I think is really about allowing ourselves to be these energetic portals between this earthly realm and other realms and other realities. And I think we've also been indoctrinated to be afraid of uh, spirit and things that we might construe as demons or evil energies. And it's not to say that those things do not exist, but I also believe that we attuning to our bodies actually gives us a really powerful navigational system and compass. So I'm really interested in, for me, this process of examining erotic grief is about coming back into an awareness of the body as a navigational system for both our well-being, the expression, the full expression of who we are on this planet, but also our capacity to access um, other realities and other possibilities. And if it's okay with you, I just thought of I wrote this poem a few days ago, and it just sort of came to me all of a sudden. And the title is Scared Sacred because I was thinking about just like this fear that I have often um, encountered. Like when I was a kid, I was so afraid of the dark. And it was sort of this like irrational, paralyzing fear. And then I had this idea of like, oh, well, what if that fear itself could be an erotic portal? What if fear itself can actually, um, what if it has the capacity to take us into ecstasy? And then I started thinking about how even though I was scared of the dark, I really loved scary movies when I was a kid. And there's something about the experience of fear that I'm really interested in right now as being something of a doorway. So I'll just read this to you. It didn't come gently. It came like a dare scratched into skin, came like hands that knew the lock because they were the door. No one asked to be saved. They asked to be named and then unnamed. When she spoke of spirits, he didn't flinch. He listened, like someone who knew how thin the walls had grown. There was no cleansing, only a tongue tracing every forbidden vowel back into her. She said, "We might have let in things that won't leave." He said, "Then let them make themselves useful." They kept going, past reason, past inheritance, into the place that tasted like before. When the door opened, the old gods arrived barefoot, carrying matchsticks and unfinished drafts. They didn't kneel. They rolled their sleeves, laid out the blueprints of myth, and asked the spirits to edit. One by one, the infernal guests took form. A girl with snakes for veins and a violin, a boy made of cartilage and riddles, a beast with two mouths and a compass. She fed them milk and bone broth, taught them how to hum through their wrists, let them dream inside her thighs until they began to forget they were ruin incarnate. He watched her laugh at the awkward, flickering haunt who tried to rearrange the books by color. She let it. They summoned even more. The fire with hands, the lust that had lost its name, the shame that smelled like sharp pennies and camphor. Each one was given a chair. Each one told a story with its knees pressed to its chest. And when she said, "I'm still afraid," he didn't soothe her. He said, "Of course you are. We just gave fear a bedroom." She kissed him hard enough to bend the threshold sideways. They fucked like fungus multiplied. They came like prophecy's bad siblings. And in the morning, a small tree had grown by the bed. It bore fruit shaped like ears. It was listening. She turned to him, eyes wild. I think this is how new worlds begin. He said, good, let's make more. And behind them, the house stretched its back, sighed through the walls, and let another door appear. So that's, yeah, it's kind of a poem and it's kind of a story, but I had envisioned it as, yeah, this idea that when we really open up to full throttle power, sometimes there is a fear of, oh, what if we're opening doors that things that we couldn't have predicted might be coming through? Um, and so in this context, I was imagining it as a relationship between these two lovers where the experience of their love and their eroticism opens the door to all of these things that are considered fearsome. And you could call them anything. You could call them emotions, you could call them ghosts and demons or whatever the case might be. Um, but I'm really interested in this process of reclaiming the energetics of fear and allowing ourselves to actually, um, I mean, I think it's important to respect fear and to also know our limits. But I think that there's also a place where fear has the capacity to transmute us and where when we're willing to sort of stand at the threshold and kind of allow whatever wants to come through us to come through, um, I think there's something about that we can learn to trust, even though it might seem scary. And I'm saying that because I feel like I know a lot of people who are really holding enormous energies that can feel somewhat overwhelming. And you used the word annihilating before, and I think that that's true as well. But again, I think that there's something about the willingness to take that journey into the underworld and to open doors that we've been told must be shut. And here I'm thinking also of the fairy tale of Bluebeard's room and kind of the cautionary tales that we've been told since time immemorial, to keep certain doors shut. But I think that we're at a time where we're being asked to open more and more doors and to allow weirdness and serendipity and ghosts and angels and pantheons of new gods. We're allowing them to enter through those doors. And so I'm really interested in how we might be able to do that. And I think the erotic is a place where we have the potential to do that.
Extraordinary. Thank you so much for sharing that. I was transported. And this feels to me like the leading edge of, I often feel like we are expressing God or goddess right now, in experience and in um, the expression of consciousness and in relationship, in intimacy and like the moment between us. And it's like this flowering edge of consciousness or of experience. And that this feels very connected to that, to me. It feels also like connecting to something that we deeply know already, that's quite old and that's in us, that's our birthright and we have ability to access. And also it feels like the flowering of something new. In terms of this, the framework and sense making that I need right now in my journey, being that we are going into something new that has to do with the union of the two, or this space of opening and creation that we hardly know how to talk about, much less experience, and that it's such an adventure. That edge is such an adventure, and that is how worlds are birthed, and that it is part of our intrinsic power, and that it does take, that it arrives at a time, that as you were talking about this timing, I couldn't hold anything like this safely, 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. It would have expressed through me, through the lenses and the beings that I had with me at that time, which was pain and darkness. And that's what expressed, and I survived it and I died both. And it wasn't, I don't know, right now as I'm thinking about it, like it was maybe exactly what needed to happen, or there is no need to, it just did. That's what happened. That's what unfolded. Uh, but I couldn't wield it in a way that felt like love. And now I'm approaching a place where what you're talking about feels possible, to be in relationship in a way that feels like love, which is a completely new um, part of this unfolding and part of this game. So I love all of that. It's extraordinary. I really do hope that you come back and talk about it more as it unfolds for you. These are the conversations that feel important to me right now. It's like there's a it feels like there's a turning of the wheel happening, and that we're, in order to maybe participate in the best way in what's unfolding, and sort of like the background change that's happening, or the expression of the divine that's happening, in order to participate with that, it feels like this is where we're going to need to step into, are these kind of abilities to hold paradox, to be with it all, to have the capacity to be with the wholeness, and to experience that moving through us in ways that aren't exiling parts of ourselves, as you said, that aren't orphaning parts of ourselves, that aren't pushing anything away, but inviting in more and more and more. And the truth is, in my life, uh, that is not without peril to the physical body, to life, in terms of how I have my life arranged, to relationships, to all of those things. These are big, enormous forces that are asking to come through. And so there's something there as well to me about community and
Yeah.
about relationship. There's, my understanding is that it's kind of required at this level of the unfolding. It's required that we have help, that it's we move from me to we. It's a move from me to we. And so it's important to have um, powerful beings around us as we're doing this powerful work. And that requires, you know, in my life and world, it has required somatic work and parts work and all of these things, so that I can become a loving space for all these parts of myself. And then that can extend out to my close circle, and it can grow. And without that, it can become, it will just fracture again instead of coming into more wholeness. So I loved this. I'm blown away. I'm so grateful that you came on the podcast, and that we had a chance just to talk to each other. And here, I mean, this is why I have to talk to people, because you said all the things that I couldn't say or express, but that are in me. And I'm really grateful for that. So thank you so much, Nirmala.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun. And, just speaking to what you were saying about the power and importance of community, I mean, I think that's exactly what we need right now. And we need sort of these ways in which it's like our multiplicity and our unity and interconnectedness get mirrored back to us, but also we can't do this alone. I think about sort of the mycelial network that is constantly working underground um, to stabilize life on this planet. And I think that honoring our stability, recognizing, like we're not just kind of um, prophets in the wilderness doing this alone and sort of tearing ourselves apart in order to do it. That's an outdated paradigm. And I don't think that that's the paradigm. That's not the paradigm of the feminine as I know it. The paradigm of the feminine is kind of this space of messy relationality and co-arising, co-emerging discoveries. And And we need one another because it's like the way that you express it is going to be slightly different from the way I or someone else expresses it. And to kind of be in this synergistic dance together and recognize, like, okay, I don't have to carry all of this alone. And I can stop and pause and take a break and trust that my loved ones will help me to carry the load as well. I mean, that's something that's been a really powerful emerging awareness for me, being sort of a recovering, I'm going to do it all by myself kind of person. And that's not really possible. And even when I think I'm doing it all by myself, I'm not. I'm really not. It's not how we're meant to walk. And I think that that's an exciting aspect of these times. It's recognizing that even though we've been fragmented, I think we're all seeing the impacts of just how fragmented we are and what it means to live in a society where the so-called loneliness epidemic has taken hold. Um, I think there are these opportunities to kind of move into a relationality that feels really fresh and new and interesting. So I'm super excited to continue these conversations because they're they're so life-giving, and I never know where they're going to take me, um, or how they're going to change me. And I'm sure that, I'm going to be changed by even just having this conversation in ways that I can't predict. So it'll be fun the next time we connect to see what has moved since then for both of us.
Yeah, amazing, right? This is alive. It's alive. And it's again feels like an antidote or it feels like the medicine of the opposites as well. That the aliveness and the unknown and the relationality and the intimacy and all of that are um, great, powerful ripples that we can't imagine both in ourselves and for others. I think a gift of connecting in with who's listening, and I know many of my listeners in the podcast, and so I've been enjoying as I've been talking to you, perceiving them listening to this because there's so many things that are resonant in the communities that I'm a part of that have not maybe been spoken so plainly or so clearly until this conversation. So thank you so much again. Such a
Oh,
pleasure.
thank you. This was amazing.
Thanks again to Nirmala for coming on to the podcast. If you are interested in having conversations like these with like-minded people who are exploring deep questions, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Robin Lassiter. For members of the Earth Lover tier, we meet twice a month. I have special guests, and we also have time to explore deep and resonant ideas with each other in a safe space full of like-minded community. If you are interested in joining any of my cohorts or groups or working one-on-one with me, please visit robinlassiter.com.